Hello, and thank you for joining us today for Wise Women, Sage Advice from Seasoned Lawmakers, the latest in NCSL's series of webinars for newly elected state legislators. My name is Katie Ziegler, and I'm the Program Manager for the Women's Legislative Network of NCSL. Our panel of female legislators will spend the next 45 minutes or so sharing advice for a successful legislative career. Before I introduce the panel, I want to let the audience know that you can ask questions via the webinar's chat function at the lower left of your screen. We will respond to questions at the end following the panel discussion. I also want to add that NCSL is your organization. All state legislators and legislative staff are members of NCSL. From policy research to networking opportunities to providing the state's perspectives at the federal level, we exist to assist you in your role as public servants. Please call on us often and let us know what you're working on. We have a great group of women that are going to be sharing their advice today. I'll be introducing them in alphabetical order. First, our discussion's moderator, Patty Berg. Patty served 3 terms in the California Assembly representing 6 northern counties, including her longtime home, Humboldt County. During her tenure, she chaired the Committee on Aging and Long-Term Care and the Budget Committee on Health and Human Services. She also chaired the California Legislative Women's Caucus. She served as the founding executive director of the Area Agency on Aging for nearly 20 years, and also was a sociology and psychology instructor at Humboldt State University. Since leaving the legislature, she has established a training program for incoming California women legislators and has served as chief consultant to the Senate Select Committee on Aging and Long-Term Care. Caroline Casagrande is in her 4th term in the New Jersey Assembly and is the Assistant Republican Leader. She is the youngest Assemblywoman ever elected in the state and is a member of the Appropriations, Financial Institutions and Insurance, and Women and Children Committees. She was a partner in a law firm in Shrewsbury and was a municipal attorney to Manalapan Township and special counsel to Fairhaven. She is the founder and director of the Young Women's Leadership Institute, a program designed to nurture leadership skills of local female high school students. Assemblywoman Casagrande lives in Colts Neck with her husband and 2 young sons. Brenda Gilmore is in her 5th term in the Tennessee House of Representatives and is the president-elect of the Women's Legislative Network of NCSL. A Democrat, she has served in leadership on the Environment and Conservation Committees and is currently a member of the Agriculture and Natural Resources, Criminal Justice, and Fiscal Review Committees. Prior to her service in the legislature, she was a Nashville Metro Council member for 8 years. She was director of Vanderbilt University Mail Services and has extensive involvement with various local, state, and national boards. She's also proud to note that her daughter has followed her in public service and now holds a seat on the Nashville Metro Council. I also note that Representative Gilmore is a bit delayed in joining us today, but she will be coming on the line a little bit later in the program. Jane Powdrell Colbert is entering her 7th term in the New Mexico House of Representatives and is the current president of the Women's Legislative Network of NCSL. She is the first African American Republican elected in the state. She served on the Business and Industry, Transportation and Public Works, and Indian Affairs committees, among many others. Her legislative and public service interests include small business and entrepreneurship and military and veterans affairs. Her background includes work as a consultant and trainer in law enforcement and city government. I'm also interested to note she's a former track star and lives in Corrales, New Mexico with her husband. And so with that, I'm going to turn the meeting over to Patty Berg from California to get us started. Patty.
Okay, thank you so much. I think this is going to be very exciting, and I'm hoping that you all will take copious notes because I think that you will learn from our mistakes. I'm going to start with, we have 5 topics that we're going to be covering. And the first topic is, if I knew then what I know now, what I would have done differently. And I think it's such a great question and obviously one of reflection. So starting with you, Assemblywoman Casagrande, what would you have done differently?
Well, I would have been less afraid of what I didn't know. In other words, when you start a legislature and you sit on your first committee and there are seasoned veterans and you maybe don't know the processes or you're not sure of the players, and I might have been a little bit too quiet at the beginning because I wasn't sure what I didn't know. But what I've learned in over 4 terms was that I knew everything I needed to know, and that's why the voters put me there as soon as I got there. I also probably would have reached for anything I wanted to happen long-term immediately. Because if you have legislation, if you have issues that you ran on, it's very naive to think you're going to move that in just one legislative session or that year. So I think sitting down as soon as you start your term and thinking long-term, strategically, what legislation you want to move, and start immediately, because it's going to take good legislation, strong legislation, legislation that changes people's lives, takes years. Point blank, it takes years to get everybody on the same page with that. So I would have started that stuff very quickly, and I would have been more fearless.
Well, I think that's great. And Representative Paudrell Colbert, what would you have done differently?
I would have found a mentor, a seasoned mentor earlier, and even probably prior to the session starting, because it's amazing, and I agree with the representative, because it's amazing what you know that you don't know that you know.
Mm-hmm.
And so you find a mentor who can help you along the way, and find a mentor maybe even prior to the session starting. That person that came to you and said, hey, why don't you run? Someone has said something to them about you. And that way it helps you to start put your plan in place as to what direction you really want to go, because you really know more than you know that you know.
I think
and
that's
you don't be afraid to ask for help, whether it's outside of the legislature early on and internally, to be able to ask for help.
I totally agree. I think from my perspective, because I've had time, I was termed out, and we have term limits in California, and we also are a full-time legislature. And so I was termed out in 2008, but have remained active with the legislature since that time. However, I've had time to really reflect on this question. And I would say there would be 4 things that I would have done differently. If I had known walking in the door that California politics was all about the money and you had to pay to play, I would have been prepared to put $250,000 into the Speaker's hand for the caucus over and above the $600,000 that I raised for my first campaign. That would have allowed me to have sort of my pick of committees, and that's just sort of how it continues to be in California. 2, I wish that I had kept a daily journal because, for books to be written later on and just remembering all of the things that one has been involved in while serving 3 terms, I wish that I kept a daily journal. I would also wish that I had joined NCSL at the very beginning to have availed myself of the network opportunities and the sharing and learning that such an organization offers. And so I strongly recommend you ladies consider that. And the last thing, in terms of 4th thing, would be that I would have paid more attention to building oversight into my bills that got signed, especially important in a term-limited environment where the administration can just wait you out. Having offered this training to newly elected women in California, both in 2010 and 2012, this was a question that we posed to former and current women legislators that were part of the faculty for the training program that we gave. And and when we asked that question, the common responses were that they would have spent more time getting to personally know their colleagues on both sides of the aisle and work to develop different partnerships, that they would have been more accessible to everyone and spent more time with the third house, especially their first year, that they would have spent more time being visionary rather than getting caught up in all the minutia. And lastly, remembering that family comes first or you end up paying a heavy price later, especially especially in a full-time legislature. I mean, probably the first term, we had 9 divorces in the state legislature amongst women. So that was a theme. And I think that takes care of the first question. So I think we're ready to go into topic 2. Keys to finding success in your first term. So we'll start with Assemblywoman Casagrande. How did you learn the legislative process?
Well, I relied very heavily on the partisan staff office that we have in New Jersey, and I'm sure all your legislators have partisan staff offices. They are people who have been in the trenches for years and years. They know the process inside and out. They know the players, and they are really, really great sources of advice and wisdom. Another key, I think, to finding success, particularly if you're working on moving legislation in your first term, is to look to whomever is a lawmaker is finding success passing a lot of their bills. Now, I serve in New Jersey as a Republican, so I have served 4 terms in the minority. So if I need to pass a bill, and I want to pass the bill and change things for my constituents, I need to find usually a prominent Democrat who's really good at passing their bills and get them to partner with me. And that works, vice versa, depending on who's in charge of your house. So I think looking for the people who are doing it already and getting to know those people and attaching, selling them on your legislation is a great way to move your bills and a way I found success as a young lawmaker.
Very good. And Representative Paudrell Colbert, how should you get started on the topics you care about, that you really care about?
I think you need to look at picking your committees is so important. And you need to pick a committee that you have some in-depth knowledge about. And pick a committee that maybe if you pick 2 committees, a committee that you don't have as much knowledge about, but that you're very interested in. And you have to know your legislation. Don't pick the hardest piece of legislation on the planet. Find a piece of legislation, as the Assemblywoman just said, that you know and that you can partnership with someone. You be the key sponsor and maybe have a Democrat, as I did in my first session, as a co-sponsor. And it was interesting because I had some of the Democrats who would pick me as a co-sponsor on their bills. So it goes both ways. Right. And you work together to get that piece of legislation through. You have to know your legislation. And you have to look at it from a perspective, at least I do, from, what affects my district? How is this going to affect my district? And if it's going to have a real big impact on my district, then I look at it extra hard. And sometimes your vote is not going to always be popular.
Right.
And then thirdly, know that you're going to make mistakes. None of us are perfect. And quick example, I signed on a piece of legislation and just read the topic of the legislation and didn't read that introduction very well. And boy, did I get burned by the media.
Oh, dear.
And I made the mistake, and I lived up to it and admitted, I didn't thoroughly review the legislation. But those 3 things, know what committees you want to be on and do some research prior to the session when you're asking for your committees. And I know that's done differently in every state.
Right.
Know which piece of legislation you're going to carry.
Mm-hmm.
And don't carry too many pieces of legislation.
Oh, I'm so glad you said that. Not your first term, right?
Correct.
Mm-hmm.
And this is Assemblywoman Casagrande. I forgot to mention two things that occurred to me while my distinguished colleague was speaking. But if you don't mind, I'd like to add a small nugget of wisdom to the young legislators. The first is town halls. They are, when you first start them, not the most comfortable meetings in the world, right? You mass mail your district, and because you're mass mailing, who's going to show up is a variety of people. Some of them happy with you, some of them not so happy with you. But learning how to stand there as a leader and answer the questions from the people across your district is great for you for two things. Number one, it educates you about what the people in your district care about. And that is so important because you are a representative. Of course, it's about what you care about, but it's more about what your district cares about. And breaking through that barrier, I did town halls constantly in my first few terms. And it led to a few things happening. Number one, I became a better public speaker from just the repetition. It's like anything else. It's like being a basketball player. If you play enough basketball, eventually you get better at the sport, right? Same thing with public service. And number two, it familiarized me to many people in the district who maybe weren't certain about voting for this, 29-year-old woman. And so that was really important. Learning my district, honing my skills, and having people who maybe didn't vote for me get to know me on a different level was really, really critical. And on that note, another thing that I thought was very helpful in my first term, just in terms of specifics, was reaching out to schools and reaching out to senior centers. Now, schools in New Jersey, we fund primarily from the state level. So for me, it was very important to have my eyes in each one of the school buildings that I fund. And you can read your reports, you can hear the studies, you can meet with the teachers union, you can hear from parents, but there is something invaluable about going into that classroom and learning, okay, well, a fifth grader in this town is capable of asking me a fifth grade question. But a fifth grader in this town who looks like maybe they weren't fed breakfast this morning seems to be asking me a question that a second grader would ask me. And I think that's very helpful to learning your district, to learning your problems, right? Because you can read all the reports you want, but until you see and experience that stuff, it's very difficult to come up with the solution. So those are two things that I think would also help young lawmakers, new lawmakers, as they learn their district and learn to hone their skill set.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Representative Gilmore, who's not yet on the line, the question that I was going to pose to her was, how do you handle competing demands, such as between your party caucus and your constituency? And I'm going to take a shot at this one, but really what I want to talk about is sharing the keys that I used in terms of finding success my first term. But in terms of competing demands, I really did not have competing demands between my party caucus and my constituents that I can recall. However, life in a full-time legislature was always fraught with competing demands because you just have to learn to live with it. But I'm a very super organized person, so I started every day with a to-do list and prioritize those. I'm also a good delegator, and I had great staff to delegate to. But the keys that I used as it relates to finding success my first term is that I was conscious of not trying to carry a heavy bill load my first term. And I said no more than 10 bills, so that I could pay attention to learning the rules because that is so important, developing relationships with colleagues and the third house, setting up my internal office policies and procedures, both for my Sacramento office and for my 3 district offices, and beginning the year in an all-staff retreat where we as a team developed our mission statement and how we would accomplish it, and then set out our first-term strategic plan, which we did every term. So I focused on that, getting my house in order, really, as it relates to my first term. And does anybody want to add anything else there?
Well, I would also add about your staff because, not here in New Mexico, we're a part-time legislature. And my first couple of years, I had a different administrative assistant. Mm-hmm. And so finally, I did get an administrative assistant who was willing to come back each year. Now we've been together now going on 6 years.
Right.
And that individual gets to know you. And she or he is so helpful in making your day run smoothly.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a meeting every morning with her, and we kind of look over the bills for that particular day that are coming up on the floor and what's coming up in committees. And she's sometimes done some research on them to come back and say, hey, Representative, did you know that? Or are you aware of that? And realizing that I'm not the first person that's carried this legislation or maybe a similar piece of legislation. So she was great. She is great at that. And
okay,
so, having someone that is that gets to know you and being able to have that person stick with you is very important.
Right. I appreciate you adding that. Topic 3, we're going to move on. I'm sorry?
You know what, Patty,
what?
This is Katie. Real quick, Representative Brenda Gilmore from Tennessee has joined the line, so I just want to say
great.
welcome. Brenda, can you hear me?
Thank you very much, and thank you all for being
Yes.
patient with me. I'm traveling today.
There's a lot of winter weather, and so we'll just let Patty move on to the next question, but I just wanted to let everyone know that Brenda is here.
I'm so glad you are here. This is Patty, and so I'm welcome to you, Brenda. Welcome.
Thank
we're
you very much.
Okay, so we're going to move on to topic 3, building strong relationships. And the first question goes to Assemblywoman Casagrande. How did you find allies?
Well, you have certain things that are priorities to you, right? I mean, no woman enters public service without some things that I call them things that get you out of bed in the morning, right? And odds are you're probably not the only person in the legislature, be they, have an R or a D next to their name, that cares deeply about that issue. So finding those people who care about the same things you care about is absolutely critical. Now, another thing that I find helpful, at least in New Jersey, our divides often aren't R&D. Our divides are often suburban-urban because of the way we fund things. So a lot of times I will find other, for instance, Democrats who represent suburban areas of South Jersey that have the exact same interests as I do, which would be different maybe than a legislator representing Newark or a bigger city, Jersey City. So finding the people who have common interests, finding the people who have the same kind of geographic district that you have is very, very helpful. And finally, like we started at the beginning of the call, finding a seasoned mentor, finding someone who's been around the block, obviously invaluable. But what I've found, because I've had a lot of mentors, is that I've never been able to just kind of focus on one person. I've focused on about 4 people. And between those 4 people, I've taken something really important, and I use each one of them as a touchstone. But finding people that have wisdom that you can relate to, and a lot of times for some people, for me, it's been more than one. And that has been very helpful to building those relationships. And I never miss staff retreats or any sort of thing we have that's an off-site, even though you might think, oh, my goodness, I spent so much time on this job already. I have 2 small kids. It's no Swiss picnic getting somebody to take care of them for a night. But the reality is those times are important. That's really important time to build those relationships with your colleagues outside the state house.
I would add to that. When you talk about mentors, because that's come up several times. Is that I also had several mentors. I had more than one. I had males as well as females. all who had a minimum of like 10 years in the legislature. And specifically, I selected people who I knew were respected, and they were known as strategic and successful. And I think that those are qualities you want to look for. So anyway, I add that to yours. Then I would like to move on to Representative Pagrel Colbert. How do you form successful relationships with those outside the legislature, such as lobbyists and the media?
Well, I have a great group of lobbyists that I worked with prior to going into the legislature. Mm-hmm. And I worked in the law enforcement community for a number of years prior to going into the legislature. And so you get to meet these people in so many different venues. And so I had some of these relationships developed prior to even thinking about the legislature. And these folks kind of followed me in. Mm-hmm. And so they have been great to work with. They've been honest, in the 13 years, I've only had one that lied. And I just cut him off and stopped dealing with him. And he was Absolutely. A new person kind of in my circle. Mm-hmm. And so I've had lobbyists that were carrying legislation for their particular entity who said, Representative, this is not a good piece of legislation, but I promised I would introduce it, and find someone to carry it. Would you carry it? Mm-hmm. And I'm sure I'll carry it for you, but I'm not going to fight to get it scheduled.
Right.
And we had an understanding in regards to that. And so we developed relationships, and come to find out, there were these that had some of the similar relationship with some of these legislators, mm-hmm. with some of these lobbyists, And they would work, and they said, Representative, did you know that Representative so-and-so had an interest in this? And so I developed relationships with these folks that have just been invaluable during the legislature and outside of the legislature. We continue to work as a team, and it's in New Mexico. It's probably easier to do that than it is in some other states because our population is small, and so almost in a sense we have to work together. Then there's areas that you just, there's some areas that I will not deal with as a legislature.
Right.
And that's just it. I don't know if that's good or bad, but it is what it is, because I have some strong feelings. My constituents have strong feelings of those areas. And so I just kind of leave them alone. And there may be some other legislators that's representing other districts in my area who will carry those. So you have to be flexible, but you need these relationships. And you need to know who to avoid as well.
Yes, exactly. Representative Gilmore, what are your top strategies for interacting with your constituents?
All right, thank you. First of all, I think the number one strategy is a legislator or leader has to return calls, letters, emails, tweets, whatever it is that your constituents are trying to get in touch with you. Whatever your standard is, whether it's 24 hours, whether it's 3 days, whether it's by the end of the week, those calls and emails must be returned. And then I think you will get a reputation as being responsive, even to the media sometimes, because they know that I'm going to return the phone call. If there's a hot issue, then I'm probably one of the first people that they call locally in Nashville, because they know I'm calling them back, and whether they agree or not, they will be able to get their piece on TV. I think number two is just being visible, and that requires a tremendous amount of energy. But whether it's you get requests to judge a baby contest, or to read during Read Me Week, come to church and present a proclamation, go to the baseball field and throw out the first pitch. The community needs to see you and see that you are involved. And on a formal basis, I try to have periodically town hall meetings, whether it's issue-driven or whether it's just to get general information out to my constituents, just keeping them informed. And then lastly, I think just shameless self-promotion. When I'm involved in something in the community, I make sure it's documented, write a little short paragraph, get a photo, and I send it to the media myself. Sometimes they pick it up, sometimes they don't, but more often they do pick it up. And I think when the community sees that you're constantly involved in the community, that also helps improve your relationship with your constituents. And even when something goes negative, it won't be quite as hard on you.
Well, I think those are very good and salient points. I represented, my district was 6 counties and 26 cities, 700,000 constituents is what I had. And getting from point A to point B in those 6 counties was 7.5 hours north to south and 7.5 hours east to west. So, because California, as you know, is a really big state. So I tried to be extremely accessible and in my district. And in fact, for this entire 6 years that I held the office, I only slept in my own bed 4 nights out of 30 in any given month. So I was in the district all the time. But I also had great staff on the ground, and so constituent service was just, I was focused on it as it relates to great casework and very result-oriented. We also held town hall meetings. Also, I had a newsletter that I sent out to constituents on a quarterly basis, letting them know what I was up to and what I was doing. I also had press for every county that I would be visiting, where I would be, so people could see that I was out there. But one of the things I would add in terms of finding allies, in California, we have a very strong women's legislative caucus, and I became very active in that caucus right away, and also started a girlfriend's dinner night every Tuesday, which is still, I started in 2002, it's still going on in 2015. So every Tuesday we would select a restaurant and then invite all the women legislators, and they would, sometimes we would have 5 or 6, sometimes we would have 25 to 30. But it was a way to network and not just talk about legislation, but talk about relationship building. And that was really, I think, really, really helpful. So moving on to topic 4, maintaining balance between the legislature work and your personal life. Oh, my goodness, that's a hard one. So, 2, Representative Pavel Colbert, I'll start with you. What are your strategies for successfully managing your time?
They're not very good. I'm all over the place. And even after all this time, as I mentioned earlier, I have a great administrative assistant during the session, which helps me tremendously in doing that. Outside of the legislature, I have a real open door policy, and I spend a tremendous amount of time around the district. And my goal when I was first elected was to develop a relationship with my constituents that they felt comfortable in saying, "Hey, Jane." And it's kind of amazing how that kind of got around to, "Hey, Jane, can we talk to you? Can we?" And I'd run into folks at stores and knocking on doors with various issues, and so it's been a little bit easier. I have an elderly parent that I also take care of, which kind of adds to the mix, and a military husband. And so, outside I decided that I will return all of my calls, by the close of business of that week. And on weekends, it's dedicated to my husband and my father.
Mhm.
And during the evenings on the weekends, of course, if there's an event, I do attend that.
Mhm.
But I'm getting better at setting time aside to deal with my legislative issues outside of the session because it's all year round. You know, people say, well, you're only a part-time legislator. That looks good on paper, but in reality, you are a full-time legislator.
Right.
And so, you know, I'm getting better at setting, you know, that time for legislative work, for my husband and my 92-year-old dad that I spend time with. And so it's not the easiest thing in the world to do, but I'm getting better at it. And I'll be honest, I'm not the greatest person in the world at doing that, but I have great relationships in my district that people help me do that. Quick story, my dad's in a nursing home, and so he knows actually more of my voters than I do, I think, because everybody has someone in this facility. And I end up having these impromptu meetings with folks at the facility. And so it makes it a lot easier. And it may sound cumbersome, but it flows well for me.
That sounds great. Assemblywoman Casagrande, how do you maintain family and personal relationships in your new role?
Well, hello. First, I'd like to echo the comments that you absolutely need to block time out. And at first, when I was a young legislator, I thought, oh, that's so selfish. That's something I can't do. My constituents need me. But over the years, I've learned that if you don't claim Sunday or Saturday or some days of the week for your family, shut down your phone. Make sure, of course, your senior staff knows that there's a true emergency, you can be contacted. But an older legislator, actually my former speaker once said to me, you can't dance on every stage. Right. And that's a hard lesson for a young person. And by young, I mean a junior states person to come in and learn, because you think you just came through this campaign, you probably had to work real hard through your seat, and you don't want to let anybody down at any point, be it, your party brass, your constituents, anybody. And you have to learn that you have to set those boundaries, because I promise you nobody will set them for you. Nobody will ever say, hey, representative, why don't you spend Sunday with your husband? Nobody's going to say that to you. Right, that's something you need to say to yourself and claim. The other thing that has been, I've had, my first 2 terms, I had a child each term. And that was an extraordinary challenge, to point blank. There's no other way to say it. I was breast pumping in the State House, and I was back to work 9 days after a C-section, because the reality is, it sounds insane, and fortunately we're a part-time legislator, but the reality is if I didn't go, then the people I represent wouldn't have had a vote. And so I tried to make sure that even though some of those things were hard and difficult, they also very much informed what I work on. I work on a lot of issues that have to do with working parents. And because there are very few women in public life with small children, almost nobody works on those issues, right? I mean, it's kind of amazing what, at least in Jersey, daycare is $1,200 a kid a month. And so it's really, really helpful in that it can inform what you work on if you have a family, if you're very active in that part of your life. But it's also a challenge. And also another caution I'd like to say to people out there who maybe have a young family is be careful of the people that will perceive you as unable to do certain things because you have small children. I cannot tell you the amount of time I have asked for something, be it a promotion, be it the ability to push a certain issue, and been told, well, Assemblywoman, we know, but you have those 2 small kids. Well, excuse me. So it's half this legislature. They might be men with small kids, but so you got to fight through that, and you can't, I guess, be totally naive and think that people don't, at least within the legislative houses, perceive your time as more limited, because they will. But you just have to be cognizant of that and work through it.
Okay. Representative Gilmore, how do you stay true to yourself?
Well, I think that that's a challenge for all of us. I would say family still continues to be my number one priority. I try to involve my family in as many activities as I can. I always ask them if my husband doesn't want to go or doesn't want to be involved. Because my daughter is now 39, and I have a granddaughter who's 14 years old. Then I don't push it. I allow them to have their own private space and their private time. But if they want to come with me, I try to involve them. I try to keep things in compartments, and that is when we're having family time or family outings, that I'm not constantly texting or checking on messages or discussing community issues, that it's just simply fun time. If it comes down where I can't combine family and a community obligation, then family always wins out. And I just try to be as honest as I can with whomever is making the request, and just say, today is my husband's birthday. I'm just going to have to spend it with him. And then I try to recommend somebody to do whatever it is that they have asked me to do. And this, the second thing is really a challenge in my life, and that is, as a legislator or leader, you have to be healthy. There's no way that we can do everything that we can from sun up to sundown if you're not healthy. So we have to exercise. You got to eat. It sounds trite, but it's true. You got to exercise. You got to eat properly and pay attention to your appearance. And then the last two strategies that I would offer is, as hokey as it may seem, you have to be grounded spiritually. And whoever is your God, I wouldn't be presumptuous enough to say who that should be. But I believe that you have to have some spirituality in your life, because sometimes things happen that just do not make sense at all. And you just have to have trust and faith that there's a higher power, and that he or she would help you through that situation. And then the last item that I have is I have an accountability circle, and it started before I ran from General Assembly. I was a Metro Councilwoman, and I had asked maybe about 7 or 8 ladies to pray with me and to help me make decisions, and they have continued over all these years to be my confidants. They see me out in the community, and if I didn't say something quite right, or if I'm not on the right side of an issue, they call me and they tell me about it. Or sometimes they just call and say, I just want to let you know that I'm praying for you and you're doing a good job, and stick to that issue. And so that accountability circle has really been beneficial. I've even had them call me and said, Brenda, I saw you today and you looked a little disheveled. When you going to go get your hair done? I love this accountability circle that I have, and they've really been true and been beneficial to me.
I think that's just great. I would just add that as it relates to balance, I mean, I'm a very good delegator, and thank the Lord I had staff to delegate to, but managing time for me has always been a challenge, in part because my district was so large and so hard to get from one county to the next county. So it just is what it was. So and that's really I think that's really difficult, and I think all three of the legislators have offered the audience some sage advice. So we're moving on now to our last topic, topic 5, leaving a legacy, and then we'll end with some final words of advice. So the question is, did you know what you wanted your legacy to be when you began your tenure in the legislature, and how did you go about putting it into place? Because the first time you come in, you've been on a campaign, you may have a long legislative agenda that you want to focus on every subject from A to Z, depending on what the polls showed in your district. But did you know what your legacy was to be when you began in the legislature? And then how did you go about putting it into place? And I'm going to start with you, Representative Padrell Colbert.
No, I did not. I just knew we had some major problems in the area with shifting sand. And I was working with homes that had been built on the shifting sand, working with families who'd had homes built on the shifting sand. And we were dealing with insurance companies and changing some of the laws around how insurance was, home insurance was addressed was a major issue. Little did I know at the beginning of my second term that we would have what's called here that 100-year flood. And I have 3, 4, 5, 600,000 $1 million homes in my district that were all but washed out.
Oh, my.
And it turned out that the individual who sold all this property had filled in areas that were runoff areas, where water always go back to its natural run. And some of this water ran under the middle of some of these 1.5-acre, 2-acre lots. So my legacy has ended up being developing a flood control system that impacts my entire district. And I'm happy to say that after now 12, 13 years that I'm on my last area. And it's amazing. My constituents come out and say, Jane, we're just so pleased to know that we're not going to be washed out this spring.
That is amazing. That is amazing.
You know, and so you don't know going in, you know, what your legacy is going to be. And so I'm thinking, you know, I'm not quite there yet, but I'm thinking mine will be this flood control system and developing a sound infrastructure here in District 44 that's going to make the difference, make such a big difference in the quality of lives of the constituents now and in the future.
That's fabulous. Fabulous. Representative Gilmore, did you know what you wanted your legacy to be when you started your tenure? And how did you go about putting it into place?
Well, I thought I wanted my legacy to be taking stands on environmental issues. When I was a Metro Councilwoman, there were so many environmental issues that plagued my community. Historically, industrial-type activities are usually placed in African-American communities or poor communities, and so I was constantly on the battlefield. When I was a councilwoman, I thought I would take that same kind of interest to the General Assembly, and I did to some extent. However, and the other, I wanted my legacy to be dealing with women issues, but I have just been all over the place since I've been in the General Assembly. So I think my legacy may not be taking a stand on content or a certain issue. I think my legacy may be, if people were at my funeral, they would say that she did everything she could to help the community. And sometimes it may be something as simple as going to court with a grandmother because they feel like that their grandchild has been treated unfairly in the city or in the school system. And other times it might be on the floor arguing for a piece of legislation that would affect the whole state of Tennessee. So I think, my epitaph will be that she did everything that she could to help.
I think that's fabulous. I just decided last week my epitaph is going to be, she tried.
Yes.
That's exactly what you're saying. That's exactly what you're saying. That's fabulous. Assemblywoman Casagrande, did you know what you wanted your legacy to be when you began your tenure? And how did you
No, like most people, I just was running because I was angry about something, right? I mean, nobody runs because they're super happy about the way their state's working. So I knew I was 29, and New Jersey at the time, still does, embarrassing, have the highest tax burden cumulatively of any state in the nation. And our property tax bill at the time, in 2007, an average property tax bill in New Jersey was $8,000. So I knew that most of my friends who I went to high school with, who were really smart, college-educated professionals, were all having a really hard time starting out families in this state because people just literally couldn't afford what we were charging. And in fact, unfortunately, this week it came out we are, again, the #1 state people are fleeing. And if you ask them why, it's because of the tax burden here. So that was what I ran initially on. But like everybody else, you change every day. I'm not probably the same person as I was yesterday, and I won't be the same person tomorrow. And I find that, at least for me, legislation is a creative process. There is an amount of creativity to it. It has to be something that I'm very interested in that moment. It has to be something that I have maybe a different solution than someone else has had in the past, right? And I think a lot of people don't realize the amount of creative thinking that goes into strong lawmaking. So since that time, I've spent a lot of time working on basically the life I was living, which is that of an average middle-class New Jersey family with small kids and 2 working parents, and trying to make that work. I do a lot of legislation that is both pro-working women and pro-business, because to me, working women are a GDP issue. And failure to take care of them and forcing the workforce dropout, which is what you call it when the daycare exceeds, the cost of your going to work, is really something that's detrimental to the whole economy. So that's something I work on a lot, and that's not really necessarily what I would have thought I was working on when I was 29, but that's what I work on now. Now, last night we had a big hearing about a liquefied natural gas port because I represent a lot of shore communities. And so protecting the shore, if you represent the shore, particularly, 2 years after Sandy, I know we discussed natural disasters. My district was devastated by Sandy. So then I had to take another turn and work on Sandy recovery issues for 2 years because I had so many people in my district without homes. So I think that life is going to give you what you need to work on next if you just open yourself to that possibility and think, what issues, and that's where the town halls come in too, because it's not only what's in front of you, it's what's bothering your constituents. And if you're someone, particularly if you're a woman in the legislature, like I felt I was in a unique position because there are very few people with a bunch of small kids serving in legislatures, right? It's a very hard job to do that and not be some sort of independently wealthy person. It's really hard to make that work, both financially and in terms of practicality. So if you have a unique position and you're not someone who's very well represented in the legislature, I think you should use that. You should use that voice. And you should also let life and your constituents guide you as to what you should be. I think it's kind of insane to think you can think of your own legacy because that's what time will do, right? But you can only work on what's in front of you.
Well, I had, I appreciate your comments, but I had a long career in health and human services and in aging and long-term care. So I knew that when I walked in the door, I knew that I wanted to develop, if I couldn't do anything else, I knew that I wanted to develop the nation's first master plan on aging and long-term care because it's a population in terms of older folks that has not been paid attention to. So the first step I did was I got myself appointed to chair the Assembly Committee on Aging and Long-Term Care, which was a standing policy committee. I hired a gifted consultant who was a gerontologist and had worked in the field of aging, both in California and in Washington State. I used aging baby boomers as the target for needed policy change and included a wide-reaching and well-respected cadre of folks in the aging field, both in California and from 4 other states, and developed 3 reports, one preparing for the aging baby boomers, which basically made the case for why now, and and then identified the emerging trends in 10 different policy areas. Second report, which was restructuring the California Department of Aging and Long-Term Care in California. And the third was building a legislative aging agenda for the 21st century, covering what are the necessary components, including restructuring, integrated data, workforce, and advocacy, and the 10 policy priority areas. So I knew what I wanted to do. I couldn't do anything else because there'd never been anyone with my expertise in aging and long-term care in the legislature before, and if I didn't do it, it was never going to get done. So I did know that. Now, we're going to end with final words of advice. Ladies, whoever wants to start this, what would be your final words of advice to our audience?
This is Representative Padrell Colbert. And I would say that this is not an easy responsibility. But along the way and along this journey, to find some joy, some real joy in taking on this responsibility. And when you made the decision to run, you know, there were some things that took place that will take place that you have no control over. There will be some funny things that will happen that you will always remember. And in this process, you know, you develop a completely new group of friends, new group of relationships, and to treasure those as you take this journey, because it's been such an eye-opening experience for me, who I thought was very worldly, you know, and traveling and everything. Going into your legislature is a completely different world. And so you have to find some joy with that.
Very good. Anyone else want to add to that?
This is Brenda Gilmore, State Representative
Yes.
Brenda Gilmore.
You betcha.
Okay, and so I
Go
would
ahead.
say to new legislators and to young legislators who are coming into leadership position that this is hard work, and so don't be really hard on yourself when things don't work out exactly like you want to, but just get up, brush yourself off, and to try again. Sometimes it takes more than 2 tries, in fact, but just persevere. Ask for help. Don't be ashamed to ask for help and to keep trying, because your efforts do make a difference in people's lives.
Very good. And Assemblywoman Casagrande.
Well, I would say 2 things. Number one, don't be afraid to ask for anything. One of the things, I'm lucky, I have the American Center for Women in Politics in my backyard in Rutgers, and one of the studies that they constantly cite over and over again are that women, by the time they ask for a promotion or a position or run for office, they usually were ready 5 years ago, right? Whereas a guy will just volunteer immediately. So since we're talking to women legislators, I'd say, please ask. Don't be afraid. And also ask right now for what you want 5 years from now, because if there is one thing I have learned in politics, it's that you very often don't get what you want on the first try. But sometimes if they know you're interested, you'll get it on the second or third. So think about where you want to be and start asking now, because your male colleagues are asking now. I promise you. You're qualified. You're ready. There's no reason you can't do it. So start asking.
Good for you. And I would add in terms of final words of advice that it's all about relationships and both building and nourishing those in both houses as it relates to being in the Capitol, being focused and becoming and being recognized as an expert in 1 or 2 areas, because you can't know everything. I'd add know how to ensure great constituent services and never take your constituents for granted. Never fall in love with your bills. Remember, while it might feel personal, always keep it professional. Always treat staff well, because being successful is truly a team effort. It's not just about you. And finally, always remember, there is no wizard behind the curtain. And with that, I'm turning it back over to Katie. Thank you very much, legislators. We're fabulous.
Thank you. This is Katie from NCSL. I want to thank each of you so much, Patty Berg, Caroline Casagrande, Brenda Gilmore, and Jane Powdrell-Colbert. We appreciate your participation and wise words of advice. This webinar has been recorded, and the archive will be posted on NCSL's website very soon. And so please, any of you who are listening, we'll send that link out to you once it's live, and share it wide and far, because we want to make sure this wisdom gets out to people just starting their careers out in the States. So thank you again to our panelists. I want to just let everyone know NCSL is having one final webinar in our series of webinars for new members on next Friday, January 16th. And you can find information about that on our website. So thank you again to our panel. Thank you to our audience. Have a wonderful afternoon.